Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. It's all going on at Red Bull Racing. Major rumours as to what the driver lineup at Red Bull looks like across both of their teams next year, with or without Max Verstappen. Sergio Perez may be benefiting from the shambles in the Red Bull second seat, getting a new drive for next year, a contract that may well be signed. And what were the mechanics behind Horner's firing over the last couple of weeks? Big rumours emerging today. This decision was made before the Silverstone Grand Prix weekend, and Helmut Marko, whatever he says publicly about the importance of Horner to that team over the last couple of decades, was key in stabbing his partner in the back. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new. As always, I greatly appreciate it. Plenty to get into as ever. We're going to start here. This is Gene Haas talking to Aya Komatsu and discussion on where this team might go next. Haas has made some good progress over the last couple of years. Obviously, Steiner did a very important job when he was part of that team, keeping them alive through the era, the Ural-Kali Mazepin era, as we know. That then came to an end in controversial circumstances, and the team was still in a very difficult position. Shortly thereafter, Steiner was let go. Komatsu came in because Gene Haas was of the opinion that more could be achieved with the money that went in. The general perception in the Formula 1 community at the time was that, let's be real, if Haas wants to deliver more results, Gene's got to put more money in. But actually, Komatsu seems to have done a very stellar job rebuilding that team to something at least respectable on maybe not much more budget than they previously had. And according to rumours, Gene Haas is kind of loving it now. They're getting some better success every weekend, fighting for points, that kind of stuff gets him pretty excited. Maybe he will put more money in, but as we'll not forget, as you guys can see on the screen here, Toyota Gazoo Racing, there has been lots of talk, Honda's back in, there's been talk about Hyundai wanting to get a team. If Toyota want to get back into Formula 1 properly, the team they would already partner with, but potentially simply buy, would be Haas, you would well imagine. But maybe Gene Haas right now has other ideas. Lots going on in the driver market, especially on the Red Bull side. Everyone's trying to figure out what's going to happen there next year, what's going to happen at other teams next year. What do, let's say, the performances of the cars next year have to dictate what driver lineups we may see? Now, Tsunoda has had a very difficult time. Technically, by percentage of a second, as it were, away from Max Verstappen, he's been better than Lawson was at the start of the season, worse though than Perez was over 2024. And maybe that's because this year's car is even trickier for anyone else to drive. Of course, Yuki only hopped into it for the first time halfway through, not halfway, but you know what I'm saying. He didn't come in initially, he came in for the Japanese Grand Prix. Didn't get pre-season testing, that certainly wouldn't have helped his preparation, but there's also no doubt that Yuki is not where he needs to be. Red Bull did say that there was a bit more promise shown by Yuki in Silverstone, but it never really transpired, especially when it came to the Grand Prix. And big rumours emerging today that Lindblad is going to get the drive. So I'm not saying this is a guarantee, it's coming out of the Italian press, but I will say that I would be very surprised if Lindblad is not on the grid next year. He turns 18 very shortly. He did an FP1 session in the Red Bull back in Silverstone. To my understanding, really impressed the engineers. Helmut Marko said that he was very impressive, and yeah, I'm pretty sure that Lindblad has been even better than expected, I would argue, from the people internally at Red Bull making these decisions. Now, the rest of their driver lineup, with Tsunoda not looking so strong and Liam Lawson being a big question mark, Hadjar was definitely better than many expected. Lindblad is almost certain to get the drive, and there are now reports emerging that, this agreement is basically done, and he will debut as a Racing Bulls driver next season. I think the chances of this are genuinely 99+%. I don't really see a world where it doesn't happen. If Max leaves, it's happening 100% because they simply need more drivers. Maybe there's a world where Tsunoda does so well and Hadjar and Lawson start doing so well that it becomes difficult to argue that Lindblad should get the drive. But even then, I still think they'll find him a seat somewhere. There is even an interesting possibility about whether they fast-track him straight to Red Bull. Now, this would be ambitious, to say the very least, but there maybe is a scenario, especially if Max was to leave, where they might do it. I don't think they're that confident in Liam Lawson to go back, although maybe they are. We'll see some evidence of that in a second. If Yuki turns it around, maybe he stays. There has been lots of talk that it might be too early for Hadjar, that they might not be so willing to put Hadjar in the Red Bull because they don't want to break him, as it were, certainly alongside Max. But obviously that would equally apply, and even more so apply, for Lindblad, who hasn't even raced in Formula 1 yet. So putting him straight in seems like a recipe for disaster, unless Max is no longer there, in which case, it might need to be done potentially if you think that he's got more potential. Hadjar could get promoted alongside Max, maybe, if he stays and Tsunoda's going to go. But I don't think that with Hadjar performing as he is, that Lindblad's going to somehow get promoted before him. Whether you even consider it a promotion is one of the fair questions. Now, the New Zealand Herald is at it again. We know that the New Zealand press have said things before about the state of affairs with, let's say, Liam Lawson, obviously a Kiwi driver. And it's not always been bang on the money, but we'll still talk about it because, as they suggest, he is increasingly likely to retain his Racing Bull seat for 2026. So this is pretty interesting for me because this wouldn't be a massive surprise in a scenario where they're struggling for drivers, which, to be fair, they are. Christian Horner even said before he was sacked that if they were looking for a driver, they would look for a Oscar Piastri, and there were even rumours about potentially an Alex Albon to go and get as well. But I don't see how feasible those options are right now, and apart from Lindblad in the junior programme, there isn't really many other drivers. And if Max leaves, it's like, well, where do you go, let's say? And even if Max doesn't leave, you've still got 3 seats to fill. Yuki's not doing a great job. Hadjar's done well, but as of recent, let's say Lawson's definitely levelled up his performance. He's been more competitive with respect to Hadjar over the last couple of rounds than he was earlier on, which is definitely good for Lawson's trajectory. But I think for Red Bull, at least this is how Horner ran the operation, and is presumably how they will still continue to run it, because I think it's the way that Helmut Marko thinks as well. But they may change things, right? With no Horner in the picture, it definitely muddies the waters in terms of what we can expect Red Bull to actually do. Laurent Mekies is a very different leader, right? And maybe Red Bull become far more corporate now than they previously were. Not to say on some level they were corporate, but they were definitely the bad boys of F1 in the sense that they would push the rules and the limits on every single regard. Wheatley, Horner, Marko, they were that team, and they embodied the Red Bull brand very well in many respects. And I don't expect the intention of that to change, but with Mateschitz out of the picture, Dietrich that is, it does feel like Red Bull has changed somewhat in their approach, and maybe we'll see that come alive. I don't think Red Bull are going to be sacking drivers left, right and centre mid-season under Mekies as they were with Horner. You guys may disagree, but my perception is that Red Bull have always felt, if this driver in our sister team is not going to be a Red Bull driver, then what's the point? And Lawson got the chance. I wouldn't say he bottled it. I mean, maybe he did to some degree, because there was a feeling from Marko that he was mentally compromised in that team, and therefore it was destined to fail if they kept him on, so they decided to let him go, drop down to the second team. But with his performance with respect to Hadjar, many would argue that there's no world in which Lawson is ever going to get promoted again, and therefore why keep him, right? So this is kind of the debate for me, is that if they don't see Lawson as a potential future Red Bull driver again, then you might as well just let him go now, or at least at the end of the season, because what's the point? If they are going to keep him, it shows that at least they have some belief that he could get back to the Red Bull team at some point. And, that decision seems unlikely in a world where Max stays, but as we know, Max is not exactly guaranteed to stay. If he even does in 2026, it's not exactly guaranteed for 2027 and beyond. So that's the Red Bull driver situation. There's a few other things happening as well, such as Valtteri Bottas, rumours linking him, of course, as we know, to Alpine. Mercedes aren't going to get in the way, but also rumours linking him to Cadillac. Now, both Perez and Bottas have been linked to Cadillac and Alpine to some degree, but according to rumours, these are the two favourites, and a Perez-Bottas relationship and a combination is not out of the realms of possibility. There was even this tweet today that, according to Ed Spencer, who is suggesting that this is a done deal and Perez will return to F1 with 2026 or for 2026 with Cadillac, and the decision will be confirmed after the Hungarian Grand Prix. So we'll see about this. I wouldn't say this is guaranteed or official or anything of that regard quite yet, but I would say that this is pretty likely right now, because Perez has been linked to the seat for a long time. There was a real feeling that he was going to get the drive. Then there were rumours that Perez is probably still going to get the drive, but Bottas was becoming an increasingly interesting option. But apparently Carlos Slim, he's back at it again, back involved, deal with Cadillac. And I also think for Perez, the more that the drama has gone on with Red Bull, the better it's made Perez look. Like, there's not many drivers that look better from a year out than Perez does, because people look back at Perez's tenure, and look, in my opinion, I still think Red Bull made the right decision to get rid of him. What was the wrong decision was to give him the contract extension, and with that in mind, you could argue that they made the wrong decision, because at that point they'd kind of committed, they had to pay him a load of money to get rid of him, and at that point maybe the entire decision was compromised. But I still think that the general theory behind replacing Perez wasn't totally flawed, but since they've done so, it's only got worse and worse. The problems that Perez mentioned with the car, that maybe to some degree were of his own doing. There was talk that, maybe Perez wasn't as vocal as he could have been in the earlier years when things were starting to go wrong. Maybe it wasn't even his fault though, because they simply listened to Max, and Max was dealing with the car, and Perez, it was falling away from him, but it wasn't necessarily his fault, as it were. And then, having made all those complaints, certainly end of 23, coming into 2024, we've seen the repercussions of that, and now the second car seems, the car in general, but the second car especially seems basically undrivable. So Perez now looks better. The fact that he was able to podium and able to win in a car that Max was also able to do the same and at a high, much higher frequency, right? But the point is that Perez over the last 12 months has only ended up looking better and better, and as a result, I'm not surprised that he's getting a spot back on the grid. The second seat could be a battle between Bottas and Mick Schumacher. We'll see if that comes true. But this is pretty remarkable. Since 2024, Max has been on the podium 19 times. His teammates have scored 19 points finishes in that time, right? So that is the comparison between the two Red Bull drivers, and this is the comparison between this time last year and this time this year. After 12 rounds of the season, Red Bull last year had 373 points. This year it's 172. I will say pretty remarkable. Alpine at 19 points are last in the championship. That is the highest, maybe by a margin actually, the most points that a last place team has ever scored, which really shouldn't be a massive surprise, but it still goes to show the level of competition that we currently have in Formula 1. But let's talk about what it means for the rest of the Red Bull organisation, because Max Verstappen, as we say on the driver's side, it's pretty important whether he stays or goes. There is a belief from Gerhard Berger, who says that he thinks that Horner was fired, at least to some degree, to try and convince Max Verstappen to stay around. Whether that will be enough is a very good question, and there were reports today that this decision was taken by Red Bull before the Silverstone Grand Prix. The Red Bull property had reached an agreement to remove Horner just before Silverstone. It could be a win-win. Keep Max happy, give the team the time to rebuild, maybe, but it's not exactly going to be ideal. Now, where does Helmut Marko feature in all of these discussions? Because we know that Marko and Horner over the last, it's coming up on 18 months really, have been at odds with one another. We believe that Horner was much more so in the Thai camp, as we know, and interestingly enough, they transferred 2% of their ownership over the last month or so to a different entity, which who owns that other entity is an interesting question for sure. Maybe it's still the Thai family, but under a different name, and therefore it gave the Austrian part of the business a little bit more power to operate. And as such, they were able to make this decision without, let's say, Yovidya getting in the way. But ever since last year, the power struggle between Marko and Horner, and increasingly they would make statements publicly that felt like they were at odds with one another, and they kind of always did that. But certainly in the last couple of years, it's felt like, wow, something had to give at some point. There was a feeling that Horner wanted Marko gone. Well, initially, I think the feeling was that Marko wanted Horner gone. Then, after Red Bull backed Horner, he went through the internal investigations and all the drama associated with that, and then Horner was staying in his role. I was of the opinion that he was going to try and get rid of Marko in some way, because it felt inevitable that someone had to win, someone had to lose the power struggle. And once the Thai family and Red Bull backed Horner, it felt like Marko was going to be on his way out the door somehow. Like, it was so, I don't know, it seemed so critical that somebody had to go. And, well, the answer is that somebody eventually did go. Even Marko said that he was surprised that Horner made the comments about the engine being an embarrassment if they beat Mercedes next year, because he says, I was surprised when I read that. Internally, he speaks differently. We are within the limits of our engine and we currently have no significant disadvantage. That's what they believe. Is Marko just saying that to convince Max? Probably, let's be honest. But this was the big report discussing how Helmut Marko was critically involved in the sacking of Christian Horner. This is what the latest reporting suggests, that Bild are talking about. Red Bull's special advisor Helmut Marko was not just present at the meeting where Horner was fired, but actually played a key role in the discussions about the sacking, suggesting that while the sacking seems to have come as a surprise to Horner, which seemed to be the case from the outside, Horner literally said it, didn't he, in his address to the Red Bull factory, that look, over the last 12 hours, I realised this is going to be the case, but this was in the works for several weeks at a meeting between Red Bull head of sport Oliver Mintzlaff, owners Yovidya and Mark Mateschitz, and Helmut Marko on the 7th of July. Mintzlaff announced Horner's departure. So that's when the decision was absolutely finalised. And they, came together for a meeting and said, okay, Horner's going to go. They informed him then that night. And then, he was officially fired on the following day with Marko and Mintzlaff, right? So that was apparently the case. But there is a real feeling that in the lead up to Horner's sacking, Marko was speaking a lot with the team about making this finally happen, maybe getting his revenge on what happened over the last year or so. Even the comment that Marko apparently publicly made, he was thankful for what Horner had done, but, in the Marko way, he wasn't especially outlandish in his comments. So that's the Red Bull side of the story. There are a couple of questions, therefore, what it means for Mercedes if this Max Verstappen to Mercedes stuff actually does really hold some weight. As it does, whether it really becomes a thing is a question. If he does go, I think it's very interesting for Russell, because Russell would be the likely man to make way. I think for some time it's been a suggestion that maybe Russell just goes the other way to Red Bull, but would he want to? If I'm Russell, I think I would prefer to go to Aston Martin, to be honest. I feel like that team has more upside, more potential, more future. There's the whole James Bond angle. I don't know. I think Russell could fit that kind of well. So, I don't know. There's a few things why, if I'm George, I would be speaking to Lawrence Stroll more so than, Lauren McKee or Marko or whatever. Don't know what you guys think about it in the comments. There was a mock-up that was doing the rounds as well, a Mercedes with number 33 on it. So, it's all going on at this one, isn't it? People are really taking things to the next level. There is always going to be a little bit of a question, if Max does go to Mercedes, whether Antonelli could be on the chopping block. Now, Kimi doesn't seem to think so. Most of us don't seem to think so. But Toto did talk about it and said, the most important thing is that the development trajectory continues to be positive. When we look at last year, it wasn't our most intelligent call to put him in the car in Monza, give him all the pressure, and then obviously with the instant, that's something in the back of your mind. But with the podium now, you can shake that off and say, I've proven that I can be fast. Throughout the year, we've given him lots of space to explore, to develop, to underhit, and also push hard when he's confident. In that respect, it's what you can expect from a driver who can be a champion one day. It's a pretty interesting assessment from Toto. I think he made a comment, I forget exactly, it might have been the Austrian Grand Prix, when he said that Kimi's trajectory is kind of as expected, it's solid, it's respectable, it's kind of what they were maybe expecting, but it's not maybe what they were hoping for. I think they were hoping that Kimi would be a bit stronger, that he'd be a bit more confident, that he'd be a bit closer to Russell than he is. Not to say that he's not very impressive and won't continue to be so going forwards, because I think that he will. And I think Russell's done an incredible job this season, full stop. So Antonelli has a very challenging benchmark. But I do think that there is an argument to say that if Kimi's gap to George doesn't come down as the season goes on, that you could make a compelling case to decide, okay, maybe Kimi is not on the trajectory we want, because as Toto says, the most important thing is that the development trajectory continues to be positive. If he doesn't feel that it is, then maybe a conversation starts to be had. But very much enjoyed your thoughts on all this stuff in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new as always. Take care, and I'll see you next time.